In a Cincinnati hospital, patients are dying at an alarming rate.
One day they would be fine, the next day they were gone.
Nurses search to discover what is killing their patients.
You can look in his eyes. You know he's dying. You say, what the hell's going on? Something's wrong here.
The unexplained deaths keep piling up, and the only way to stop them is to solve the mystery before more lives are lost to this unknown killer. Cincinnati, Ohio, 1986. At a long-term care hospital, Clyde Douglas is gripped by a sudden and unexplainable pain in his chest. He cannot breathe. He is in total respiratory failure.
Okay, we'll be able to shock him.
And goes into cardiac arrest.
I'm charging. Clear.
The staff works frantically to save him. They do all they can. But Clyde Douglas is dead.
He was gone just like that. He was dead, just like that. He was gone within 20 minutes or a half hour at max. He was just gone.
His death is difficult for the nurses who treated him. Clyde Douglas was not the first of the patients at the long-term care hospital to die mysteriously of sudden respiratory failure.
One day they would be fine, the next day they were gone. And totally unexpected, totally out of the blue.
The facility was full of the city's sickest patients. But in a hospital where death is common, these deaths are suspicious.
They showed no signs prior to that there was anything going on.
How could nurses protect the patients they care about when something in their hospital is killing so suddenly and at random? July 8th, 1986. Paramedics respond to the scene of an accident. "44-year-old John Powell is slammed by a car while riding his motorcycle to work. When paramedics arrive, Powell is unconscious and unresponsive, suffering massive head and chest injuries. The hospital is only minutes away, but there is little hope that Powell will survive. At the hospital, doctors prepare for the incoming trauma patient. Riding without a helmet, Powell's head smashed against the concrete. He was then dragged over the pavement, producing multiple deep abrasions. Powell's injured brain is beginning to swell, and doctors know without immediate surgery to relieve the pressure, John Powell will die. John's wife is notified of her husband's condition.
When I arrived at the hospital, John was in surgery. I was told that his condition, it was a life and death situation. Heather, my oldest daughter, she started to pass out. And Holly, my other daughter, was almost hysterical. And my son was just speechless.
John Powell miraculously survives surgery and is moved to the intensive care unit.
I really didn't know if he was going to make it at that point.
But his prognosis still doesn't look good.
I was just concerned, though, because it didn't look good, but he had just come out of surgery. He was swollen and very bruised.
For his wife, Patricia, it is a shock to see her husband incapacitated.
He was an assistant scoutmaster, and he liked wildlife, and he loved camping and the motorcycle. He was a rock.
Weeks pass in intensive care, but Powell does not improve. Doctors tell his wife that if he does not begin to make some progress, he will have to be transferred to the long-term care facility, the same one plagued by a rash of mysterious deaths.
Because we're all rooting for you.
It was a long-term care facility that had a lot of people that were not expected to survive.
This facility was a place for the chronically ill, the elderly, and patients that were incapacitated or in comas.
Very few that came to that hospital were expected to leave. Very few did leave. Most of them he took down to the morgue.
The public perception was that people were sent there to die.
But even at a place where patient deaths were common, the recent number of sudden respiratory cases were staggering.
I would take about 3 a week from 2 different floors to the morgue.
We can't do any defibrillation.
Was the hospital staff slowly recognizing a silent killer lurking at their hospital? Even if they were, there was no way to stop it, and no way to predict the next patient to fall. The killer strikes at random and without warning. The smallest sign of distress turning deadly in an instant. An orderly notices Leah Matthews struggling to breathe. He asks the nurses to respond to the patient.
Maybe come with me.
Only a few hours earlier, Matthews was stable and recovering well.
Matthews?
Nurses rush to the room,
Matthews?
but it is too late. Matthews is dead. The official cause of death is respiratory failure. But no one can explain why Matthews' lungs and heart suddenly failed.
If you got a spiked temperature and your respiration is erratic, blood pressure shooting to the moon, they may give you this in an IV to take care of the blood pressure, this for the respiration, or something to combat all these symptoms. But if you're doing all these things normal, and then bam, you're dead. It don't happen.
Back at the intensive care unit, doctors caring for John Powell have no choice but to ask John's wife, Patricia, to consider transferring him to the long-term care hospital.
There wasn't anything more that they could do at that point, but he needed to go for rehabilitation.
Patricia finally agrees to transfer her husband. She has no idea it is the same hospital where patients are mysteriously dying of sudden and unexplained illnesses. After a horrifying motorcycle accident, John Powell spent 6 weeks in a Cincinnati hospital, struggling to recover in an intensive care unit. When doctors finally felt they couldn't do anything more for him, they recommended his transfer to a long-term care facility.
You can come in now.
When Powell arrived at the hospital, nurses knew his injuries were severe.
There were lots of bandages that had to be taken care of. He also had a feeding tube in his stomach, and that required a lot of care.
But even with the odds stacked against him, Patricia Powell believed her husband was getting the right care.
The nurses and nurses' aides were so good to John, and they were so good to the whole family. And I felt that he was in a good place. I really did. And we visited every day to be with him, so I sort of felt like, you know, we were one big happy family.
Just as John was arriving at the long-term care facility, other patients with severe head trauma joined him. Leon Nelson was transferred there after brain surgery left him in a coma. Nelson's wife, Sandra, had heard the rumors about the hospital.
Well, I didn't want him to go there because we had always heard that you just went there to die.
Over time, Nelson's condition stabilized.
I would go and visit, and I would talk to him because the doctors told us that he can hear you. Just talk to him about what was going on in our lives, and what was happening. Sometimes I would go and I would wash his face, not because it needed, just for something to do. But we would talk with him.
I really need you to try to get better.
Leon Nelson's daughter, LaShawn, who was at the time in her teens, was devastated by her father's condition.
And we need you at home.
So I'm the baby girl and very close to my dad.
And we need you.
I was just spoiled, absolutely spoiled. I could go to him and say, Daddy, and he would just say, okay, here you go. And it was just one of those things where I loved my dad a lot. Wherever you saw him, you saw me. So we were sort of inseparable. He was my dad, and I was the little girl just hanging on his leg.
Sandra and LaShawn stayed by Leon's side, and he started to show signs of improvement.
I had hoped that he wouldn't be there long. I had hoped that he would come out of the coma and be able to come back home.
Dad?
I remember telling him, Daddy, I love you. I'm getting ready to go. And he squeezed my hand 3 times. I was so excited, and it gave me a little bit of hope, that maybe he would get better.
Leon Nelson seemed to be on the road to recovery, but things took a major turn for the worse. After several months in the hospital, a nurse discovered Leon had stopped breathing.
I thought his condition was stable. I didn't have any reason to believe that he was going to be dead. I mean, I was looking forward to going to see him.
By the time the nurse summoned doctors, it was too late. Leon Nelson was dead.
10 after 9.
I have a child that I have to raise, and I don't know, how I'm going to deal with this because she's lost her dad.
Leon's condition was stable. He had been showing signs of improvement. Doctors told his wife there was no reason to think he would get worse. What could have caused his sudden respiratory failure?
Leon Nelson's death was out of the blue. The staff did not expect him to pass away. It was a shock, certainly to everyone on the unit.
The whole staff felt dejected, especially the nurses that were in charge of that patient. And you feel that for the simple reason is you do the actual application of care yourself daily. It's a family-like thing. So when somebody's hurt in the family, everybody hurts. But when somebody dies, everybody, feels the hurt, especially the nurse that's been close to her.
Leon Nelson was getting better. How could someone who was beginning to improve die so quickly and without any warning signs? His unexplained death, coupled with the other respiratory failures, convinced hospital staff that something was terribly wrong.
They went to checking charts, checking who gave medication. Did somebody mess up? And they come to the conclusion nobody messed up. Something happened.
And it happened more than anyone originally thought. In their search, they discovered Leah Matthews, Leon Nelson, and Clyde Douglas weren't the only ones to die unexpectedly on that same hospital unit. There had been many others.
We were talking about the number of deaths that had occurred in our unit and wondering what was going on, why we were having all these deaths.
What was happening to the patients? Could there be a deadly and unexplainable respiratory epidemic in the hospital?
It throws the whole staff into turmoil because you don't know what's happening, but you sense something is wrong.
In the midst of the tragic deaths, John Powell, on the other hand, came out of his coma. He began to respond to jokes from the orderlies.
Guess who?
One day, I walked in and Donald Harvey was there, and he had said, "John, guess what? Your better half is here." That was the first time I really saw John smile. That was the first of many smiles, but he smiled.
After 6 months, Powell was gradually showing signs of recovery.
We had been told that he wasn't expected to come out of his coma. He defied everything.
Patricia Powell kept a diary that she hoped to read to John when he recovered fully.
John, we had a good visit. You exercised your right fingers with your left hand. You're progressing more and more all the time. I love you, Pat.
But like many of the other patients at the hospital, Powell's miraculous recovery would suddenly stall.
Blood in his trach tube.
He woke up one morning with a bizarre bout of bleeding and respiratory distress.
He would bleed from his trach side and from his tube feed side.
Dr. Dre?
He was just struggling, and there was a lot of blood. Never could figure out what was going on. It would be severe enough that we thought we were going to lose him. He would be sent to a hospital in an ambulance because we were not an emergency hospital.
John Powell's sudden respiratory trauma was further proof that something was terribly wrong. But no one knew what it was. In 1987, nurses at a long-term care hospital in Cincinnati, Ohio, began to fear something was killing their patients. Patients continued to die without showing any sign that they were growing worse. They found themselves battling a mysterious illness that struck at random. Without knowing the source, the staff couldn't protect the patients they cared for like family. The deaths seemed to be occurring more frequently. A nurse would check on a patient they had seen only hours earlier and discover they had mysteriously stopped breathing.
Mr. Nolan?
It didn't seem to matter how vigilant the nursing staff was in checking on patients.
Mr. Nolan?
They could not save them.
Mr. Nolan?
The deaths came on too suddenly, and what was worse, the deaths were becoming more frequent.
Something's wrong. He wasn't like that. Because I'm taking his blood pressure, I'm taking his temp, I'm talking to him while I'm taking care of him, and just next you come back off a day and he's dead? I said, maybe it's the air they're breathing.
The nurses had seen death many times before, but never such a pattern of unexplainable respiratory failure.
This is a small hospital, and
The shot showed you this, that this guy had made improvement, doing better. One day he's smiling, the next day he's dying. All of it comes into focus then, you know.
The mysterious killer was taking patients at record rates.
Staff were definitely talking at the time when we noticed all these people started to die on us. We may have had maybe a death a month, and now we were up to, in 3 months, maybe 11, way over what it should have been, and was definitely not normal.
James Hale and fellow nurse's assistant Donald Harvey couldn't figure it out either.
Me and Harvey worked together all the time. I said, man, what's going on? He said, I don't know, Jim. I said, man, something's wrong. He said, yeah, you know, we here just a shift. I said, yeah, but I'm working 12 hours a day, at least 3 of these days, and, you know, 7 days a week. And so I know something's going on.
No one on the staff had any idea what or who might be behind the mysterious deaths. And it wasn't only the deaths that concerned the staff. John Powell had been suffering strange attacks while at the long-term care facility.
When John Powell was having the hemorrhaging episodes and the respiratory problems, everyone was talking about it, trying to figure out what was going on.
But each time he was transferred for emergency treatment, he miraculously recovered. Patricia Powell had no idea what was wrong.
Since he was progressing, I guess I didn't really understand it, but I really didn't know for sure what was causing his problems.
Powell returns to the long-term care facility, but in a matter of days, he inexplicably gets sick again. What was it about the hospital that was slowly killing John Powell?
I'm no doctor or nurse, but you can see the change in the color, his complexion. Something's wrong here, you know, or like the lips dry up, you say, well, maybe something wrong with his kidney or liver or something, you know? But just in one day?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir, right away.
This guy's sick. I mean, sick. You can look in his eyes and his face. When something happened to him, you can see his paleness come through. You know something's happening, but what it was, you don't know.
Even with the setbacks, Powell did make progress.
The staff, I believe, was very surprised about his progress, and at one point they called him the miracle patient.
Patricia Powell continued to keep a diary.
John, we had a good visit. Your progress is terrific. Holly was with me, and you waved goodbye. Love, Pat.
Nurses worked tirelessly with Powell to help him regain some limited motor function.
And we were really working diligently with him to try to get him to the point that he would be able to go home, that would be a viable option for him. And he was reaching that goal little by little.
But each time Powell would take a step forward, he would have a major setback.
I looked at him, and the skin, you could see the ash in the skin. I asked the nurse, what happened? She said, Jim, something as bad is happening here. They know something's going on.
Over the course of the next several months, Powell would suffer a number of respiratory emergencies, each one landing him in the emergency room.
Send the doctor to this.
He would have one of these hemorrhaging episodes and do great, come back all healthy, and then a while later he would have another one of these episodes, and the whole thing just kept going in a cycle.
Maybe because Powell was younger and stronger than the other patients, he was able to barely fight off what had killed so many others. But still, no one could find the source of his problems.
They would run tests on him, never found anything.
He was lethargic, I guess, for a lot longer. I couldn't see that bounce coming back like before.
But even surprising his own wife, Powell would battle back. He started to maneuver around the hospital in a wheelchair.
It was so unexpected. The feeling of seeing someone do what you never thought that they would do, ever, and how excited the family was because they were getting their dad back.
He was overjoyed, and you overjoyed for him. And you know, you can feel tingle, little bumps, you know.
Powell was making such good progress that nurses started preparing him to leave the hospital. Perhaps Powell would overcome the odds and beat what had killed so many other patients.
We were so excited just made us work harder to help him because he was a young guy. He wasn't that old.
John, Mary Jane and I were here but didn't see much of you because they had you all over this hospital. Occupational therapy, physical therapy, the podiatrist, all kinds of things. And wow, you were all worn out, but we had a short visit with a few smiles. Love, Pat.
As Powell was recovering, he got a new roommate, a man named Charles Ward.
He was one of my favorite residents. One time I tried to give him a TB test, and he told me that he would only let me do that if I went down to the candy store and got him a bag of butterscotch hard candy, so I did. Often we had to do that with him.
Like so many other patients, Ward began to suffer breathing problems. Doctors and nurses struggled to revive him, but Ward failed to respond.
You look at it and you're perplexed. You make your report to the nurse and you say, what the hell happened? Yeah, you know, what happened? You ask the nurse, we don't know, Jim. It keeps you on a roller coaster.
For nurses, Ward's death was the last straw.
I can remember standing back from him and watching him die and documenting in the nurse's notes everything that was occurring. Afterwards, I went into the nurse's lounge and just fell apart.
At the hospital, an unexplainable killer is striking randomly and with deadly force. Nurses' frustrations are growing. Patients aren't safe, and there is no way to predict who will fall next. Nurses at an Ohio hospital were working to understand a rash of mysterious and sudden deaths. The most recent patient death, Charles Ward, fit a pattern. It was too sudden to be natural.
That was another one of those deaths that kind of came out of the blue.
Even patients' family members started to grow concerned over the unusual number of deaths. Patricia Powell began to suspect that something strange was going on at the hospital.
When I would visit John, I got to know a lot of the other patients in his room's families, the very nice families, and we would talk. And one after another was passing away, and it bothered me after a while because all the patients whose families I got to know, they were no longer there. They had died, and I did wonder about that. I mean, I just thought, my goodness, there's too many people in this room where John is dying all the time.
Concerned hospital staffers knew they could wait no longer to investigate. They started by poring over records of patients who had died.
They investigated like a bunch of bees. They went to crossing them charts up, seeing who was here then, who was there then.
When the nurses finally got together to calculate the number of mysterious deaths, the resulting figure sent shockwaves throughout the entire hospital.
Someone pulled out a piece of paper and started writing down names, and we were all calling names out as we went. And what we ended up with was a list of, was it 11, maybe 16?
The number was too high to be a coincidence. Something was terribly wrong. Nurses thought they figured it out and notified supervisors of their suspicions.
When we start talking about the list coming out and bringing all of that to the head nurse's attention and the administrator and the director of nursing, all of the chain of command within that hospital, I mean, we would talk about it and we would take the list and we'd be told no, there was no reason to even look into that.
But the nurses were met with skepticism from their superiors. Many patients died at the hospital, and supervisors said there was nothing that should arouse the nurses' suspicions. But everyone was suspicious. Patricia Powell had a strange visit with her husband soon after Charles Ward's death.
John seemed a little desperate with his eyes at that point. You know, they kept going back and forth and looking at me and back to the side.
John Powell may have known how Charles Ward had died, but he couldn't communicate it to his wife. And he may have feared for his own life.
I told him, I said, I feel you're trying to tell me something, and I will do my best to try to figure out what it is. I just didn't know. I felt bad I didn't know.
What Patricia Powell didn't know that evening as she left was that it was the last time she would ever see her husband alive. The next morning, nurse's assistant Donald Harvey told a nurse something was wrong with John Powell.
Mr. Powell? Mr. Powell?
Powell wasn't breathing.
Mr. Powell? Mr. Powell, I'm not getting a response.
No breathing?
They did everything that they could do to save him, and we knew that he wasn't going to make it.
All clear?
You could just tell that he was slipping away little by little, and he knew that. He was crying, and he was such a fighter.
Clear?
The one thing that always stuck with me through that was watching him cry.
I received a call from the hospital, and a doctor had told me that John had just died about a half an hour earlier. I just wasn't expecting that. I knew he was having a little setback, but I just still didn't expect him to die. They asked me if I wanted to come to the hospital and see him, but I was in a state of, I knew I had to try to break the news to the children, and I just couldn't go back to the hospital that morning in the state I was in at that time.
We're going to call the code.
Hospital staffers took Powell's death
428.
extremely hard.
When he passed, I just felt the hurt. I could see him with that one arm in that wheelchair. I could see me helping him back in bed. The nurses were infuriated.
Nurses scoured their charts and medical records to make sure Powell's death wasn't the result of a medical error.
I mean, they went to checking charts, checking who gave medication. Did somebody mess up? And when they come to the conclusion nobody messed up, something happened. I mean, they were hot. And you could see the air was heavy. I mean, from one end to the other end, that air was thick. Something happened to him.
Frustrations led to finger pointing.
They quiz each other. They want to see the evening nurse, the night nurse. They sit down there. Look. They said, no, this is what we did. And they checked medication that's out. Medication was here. And they crossed this medication. No medication is missing nowhere. Nothing is out of line.
When nurses realized they had made no medical errors in Powell's case, they put their hopes in the autopsy to give them a clue as to the cause of his mysterious death. Because Powell's death resulted from an accident, the law required an autopsy. As the coroner, Dr. Lehman made an incision in Powell's stomach. He was struck by the aroma of almonds. It was something he hadn't encountered since medical school, and it terrified him. And it was a scent that signaled a huge break in the case.
He was very ill, he was expected to die. The cyanide just shouldn't be there.
The toxic poison cyanide makes it impossible for the body's cells to use oxygen. So people with cyanide poisoning are literally suffocated. The cyanide could only mean one thing. A murderer was running loose in the hospital. But if other patients had also died the same way, they weren't only dealing with a murderer. They might be looking for a serial killer. In 1987, nurses at a Cincinnati hospital were concerned about a rash of deaths on one particular unit. 44-year-old John Powell, who miraculously emerged from a coma, had suffered mysterious bouts of bleeding and breathing problems.
Mr. Powell.
Within months of arriving at the hospital, he began to hemorrhage and suffer respiratory failure. Within hours, he was dead. An autopsy by the medical examiner detected cyanide in Powell's system. But at first, he couldn't rule out the possibility of suicide. But how could Powell have killed himself?
Mr. Powell could not swallow. He could not take anything by mouth. The only way to get in the stomach was through the gastrostomy tube.
Somebody had poured the cyanide into his feeding tube. John Powell had been murdered.
All indications are.
You have now a sense of urgency because if somebody killed one person, they could kill another.
Following standard procedures, detectives started with the question of motive. Who would benefit from poisoning John Powell?
The only people who would have any reason or motive for that would be the family members.
2 weeks after John Powell died, detectives showed up at Patricia Powell's home.
They showed me their badges and told me they wanted to talk to me about some medical records of John's. There was a few things that they wanted to go over with me.
As the interview progressed, Patricia Powell learned that her husband had been murdered.
I just couldn't believe what I was hearing. My heart was beating real fast. It was bad enough that he died, but to find out that someone took his life, it was devastating.
Incredibly, police seemed to believe that John Powell's devoted wife, Patricia, had killed him.
They read me my rights. It was a horrible experience. It was like a nightmare.
Patricia Powell insisted she was innocent. She would never harm her husband. To prove it, she agreed to take a polygraph test. It confirmed her story. Without any solid suspects, detectives interrogated all doctors, nurses, and orderlies who had access to John Powell's hospital room.
We did some background on some of the medical people there, brought those people in that we felt might have at least believed in euthanasia. Or we had interviewed about 32 people.
One name came up repeatedly. A man who had easy access to all the victims. A man who had worked at the hospital for years.
One of the nurses there mentioned Donald Harvey's name, said that he commented to her that he had been involved in an investigation like this before at Veterans Hospital. That's where he worked previous to that.
This was the same person nurses had suspected earlier. They realized that at the time of the deaths, in most cases, the nurse's assistant on duty was Donald Harvey.
We realized the common denominator was Donald Harvey. There was quite a lot of discussion about Donald and whether he would do something like that.
It was too terrifying to consider that Harvey was murdering patients.
I was defensive. I said, why would you say that about him? He was an excellent artist. I mean, he was meticulous in everything he did. You know, he was just, he was tip-top. It never comes across your mind that somebody would intentionally hurt one of these patients. You couldn't even conceive that.
But no one could argue with the evidence.
And when they called me in and laid it down, you'd have to be blind not to see.
Harvey had even heard about the nurse's suspicions.
There were times that Donald Harvey would kind of joke about it among staff and make little comments, and as if it, to kind of brush it off.
James Hale, whom Harvey called Big Daddy, recalled a chilling conversation he had with Harvey.
I said, hey, something's happening to these people. Big Daddy, ain't nothing happened. People in here die. That's what they come here dying. I said, yeah, Donna, but we didn't send a lot of them out here. You got to get used to it, Big Daddy. I said, no, you never get used to people dying. He said, oh, you will.
Police decided to investigate Harvey further. They called him in to take a polygraph exam. Detectives told Harvey they knew what was happening at the hospital and how he was involved. After 4 hours of intense interrogation, Harvey finally cracked. He confessed to killing John Powell.
I did it because I felt sorry for the guy.
Donald Harvey told us during the confession that he used the cyanide and poured it directly into John Powell's G tube, his feeding tube, which it would go straight into the stomach.
Tell us about it.
It was difficult to believe that a man trusted to care for the sick was murdering the very patients he was charged with helping. The hospital is supposed to be a safe haven, and Donald Harvey was accused of killing the vulnerable and virtually defenseless. At first, Harvey claimed that he killed Powell to relieve his suffering. As the interrogation progressed, his story changed.
And during that confession, he commented, too, that he had poisoned John Powell previously with smaller amounts. And that could explain the reason when we looked at medical records, you could see that some days he wasn't doing well and other days he was.
Donald Harvey was booked on charges of aggravated murder and taken into custody. After his arrest, police obtained a warrant to search Harvey's home.
We didn't find anything there that would help the case. There was no cyanide found there at all.
Without finding any more evidence, Donald Harvey could walk. A suspected murderer would be free. The entire case hinged on a confession.
If the confession got thrown out, then we would have a problem. We still couldn't find anybody that could actually put him in there with any type of cyanide or doing anything with John Powell.
Harvey had only confessed to the murder of John Powell. But the nurses believed Harvey had killed more than one person. And the police investigation should focus on more than just Powell.
After Donald's arrest, everything stopped, and there was no other mention, no other investigation. We didn't hear anything. It doesn't take a brain surgeon to figure out that when you've given someone a list of names that you suspect died suspiciously and it's not looked into, there's a problem. And that's all we wanted, was somebody to listen.
The nurses took their story to the media. Nurse Huber called a local TV anchorman.
Yes, I'd be interested in talking.
I can remember sitting in my bedroom on my bed, wrapped in a blanket. I was shaking so hard, I could hardly talk. My teeth were chattering. That's how difficult it was to make that phone call.
By taking their story to the media, the nurses were taking a major risk that could jeopardize their careers. If they were wrong about their suspicions, there would be dire consequences. But the nurses knew they couldn't stay silent. They gave the reporter a list of 18 deaths they considered suspicious. They also gave him schedules showing that Harvey was on duty when all the patients died. The reporter broadcast the story, alleging Harvey could be a serial killer. Behind the scenes, investigators were desperately attempting to find proof that Donald Harvey was involved in more than one murder.
The coroner's office brought in records from everyone that had died recently, everyone with autopsy, until the case was solved. If we go through these records, you'd find very sick people and they died, but they all were expected to die. Just going through the medical records just wasn't working.
Pressure from the media convinced Harvey's attorney that prosecutors were closing in. Donald Harvey then made the ultimate confession. In order to avoid the death penalty, Harvey agreed to give investigators information on additional murders.
He had a remarkable memory, who was there, what nurse was working at the time, what poison he used, the reaction of the patient.
Harvey told prosecutors he had smothered Leon Nelson using a plastic bag he found in the room. Nelson was in a coma and could do nothing to resist his attacker. The revelation shocked Harvey's co-workers. Donald Harvey, a person they thought they knew well, was a cold-blooded killer.
To smother a person, to smother the life out of a person, I want you to think about it. Who could do that? Who could do that? And you know who you smother. When I found that out, how he died, I had to leave that profession.
Harvey then directed police to evidence that corroborated his story. Stuffed in the back of a picture frame was a handwritten list of his victims by dates and bed numbers. He must have kept it as a trophy, a horrible record of his murderous spree. Authorities exhumed 10 bodies. The autopsies found residues of arsenic and even cleaning fluid, further confirming Harvey's confession. On August 18, 1987, Donald Harvey pled guilty to 24 counts of aggravated murder and 1 count of felonious assault. Because he could not be sentenced to death, he received the maximum punishment, 80 years to life. Orderly Donald Harvey tried to explain why he chose his victims.
Donald Harvey said that people would bring their loved ones there and leave them and never go back to see them, never cared about them. Well, he lied. He lied. He lied, because there was somebody there to see Leon every day. Every day.
Harvey's murders might have continued for years, if not for a keenly observant deputy coroner. And the tenacity of nurses, so attuned to their patients that they could recognize suspicious deaths even in those with terminal conditions. But the case took its toll on all who were involved in it.
I never went into another hospital setting. And from that point on, I went to an entirely different type of nursing and started, I guess, over and made sure that I got supervisory training, and from that point on, I was in charge.
Through the tragedy of John Powell's death, a serial killer was stopped.
I felt that John's death was significant in stopping the killing of any more patients. So I think of that quite often. I guess in some way, he was a hero